I'm delighted to invite up the moderator of this discussion because he's a very dear friend and a regular here at the Eurasian Media Forum. Don't believe a word he says about my consumption of ties, as I'm sure he's going to tell you, but please, a warm welcome to the Global Director for Bloomberg from its London base, Mr. Todd Baer.
Thank you, thanks very much. I learned about the consumption crisis about 10 years ago in Riz Khan's tie closet in the Washington Bureau of Al Jazeera. And Gita was there as well. I desperately needed a tie. I was 2 minutes away from a live shot, and I went into this man's tie closet, and he had about $25,000 worth of ties. And I didn't know which to choose, so I went on the air without a tie. Well, thank you very much. It's a great honor and privilege to be here today. Special thanks to Her Excellency, Dr. Dariga Nazarbayeva, for the invitation to moderate. We have a very exciting panel. It is the consumption crisis, as Riz mentioned. We're talking about, look, the world's population is steadily growing. The gap between income in developed and poor countries is exacerbated. The energy crisis is increasingly manifesting itself. Many governments around the world are looking for ways to develop green energy. In addition to energy challenges, food problems are also aggravating. How effective is food consumption? What about the problem of food waste and the effects on the environment? We have 5 great speakers on the panel, starting with Ambassador Jim Woolsey. He was head of the CIA in the mid-90s. He's an energy conservation expert, a strategic advisor to Genie Energy, and a member of the board of directors at Siva Power. Ambassador, please come up to the panel. Thank you for joining us, and welcome. Our next speaker is Steve Finn from the United States. Mr. Finn is a food waste and sustainability expert and is the Vice President of Food Waste Prevention for Leanpath, the global leader in food waste prevention systems. Steve, welcome to Kazakhstan and welcome to our panel. Thank you. Next, we have Mr. Jorge Fonseca from the United Nations Food System Strategic Program. He is based in Rome. Jorge, mucho gusto, amigo. Thank you. And our final 2 speakers are award-winning members of the media who do a great job of covering this issue of overconsumption. First is Miss Jasmine Acuna. She's the co-founder and editor of El Surtido, an independent news media outlet in Paraguay. El Surtido focuses on coverage of human rights, gender, the environment, and technology. Jasmina, welcome to the panel. Thank you. And finally, we welcome Mr. Basant Rathore. He's a senior executive of strategy, business development, and brand at the Hindi language newspaper Jagran Prakashan in Delhi, India. Mr. Basant, welcome to the panel. So we're going to begin by offering each panelist a chance to make a brief opening statement about the global consumption crisis. And I'd like to start with Ambassador Jim Woolsey, the former head of the Central Intelligence Agency in the mid-90s. Jim, go ahead.
We spoke before the session here about your desire for me to betray some secrets of the CIA and actually to tell this fine group in detail how we conduct covert operations. And I was stunned at the request, but the more I thought about it, the more I thought this is a small and discreet group. And I think perhaps we could have one reminiscence. It happened because when it was brand new at the CIA as director in early '93, I got an invitation to attend the reunion, call it, of my law school class, actually my undergraduate class in California. And I was very busy and thought, this is not a good idea, it's a waste of time, Woolsey, forget it. And then I realized I really kind of wanted to see some of these old friends, and so I told my morning meeting, my senior staff, that I was going to be going to my class reunion in about a month in California, and I just wanted to let them know so they could make plans. My head of security, whose nickname was Buck, and who is about 190, 200 pounds, maybe 6'8". Buck came over to me after the morning meeting and said, Director, this is not going to be a government trip. And I said, Buck, I know I've got to write out a check and pay for it. That's not surprising to me. He said, yes, sir, but we also really want to ask you to fly an alias. And I thought, well, what's bad about that? A covert operation. I get to fly an alias. And then I realized as I walked out of my office to go to a meeting that, that meant there go the frequent flyer upgrades. I was going to fly, coach with my security people out to California. And that is in fact what happened. Buck and his colleague, who was about 20 pounds heavier and 5 or 6 inches taller, came around, and when I got to the airport, took me into the cockpit where they showed the pilot and chief flight attendant that they were carrying weapons and were authorized to by the federal government. They took me through the rest of the cockpit. They took me through the galley. They took me through the first class cabin. They took me through the business cabin. And they took me through all of the coach cabin except for one tiny alcove at the back, which had been newly remodeled and seemed to have at least half a dozen chairs in it, to the point where I was completely jammed against the door of the John as the system moved forward. Well, for most all of this trip, I'm getting banged about by people going into the John, coffee spilled on me, etc. We get to San Francisco, start to go down the passageway, and the flight attendant comes over and whispers something to Buck. And Buck says, starts laughing. I had not even seen Buck smile in the 2 months he'd been the head of my security detail. I said, Buck, what's so funny? He said, you know what she said? She said, I've been on these flights now for 20 years, and that is the politest and best behaved prisoner that you've ever really brought to me. So, covert operation succeeded under difficult circumstances. You got your story, MC.
Well, I thought that was off the record this morning, but you put it on the record, so we're going to use it, okay? Thank you, Ambassador Woolsey. I now want to turn it over to Jasmine Acuna of Paraguay, who is a heroic editor and correspondent there. Can you just give us an opening statement about how you want to address this issue of overconsumption?
Hello? I would like to point out the issue of production. I think that when we talk about consumption, we need to also look at production. And I think that the food crisis has powerful actors who are responsible for the demise of our ecosystems and land inequality, who are two things that are driving the food crisis. And their economic interests are pushing people at risk, which means that they're pushing people into poverty, and that means also hunger. So I think that our role as journalists is to let people know what the names of those people responsible are. Those names should be known. And that, I think, is our role when we talk about the food consumption crisis, which also entails production. How are we producing food? I think that's a question that we should address too.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Steve Finn from the U.S., your opening statement.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Our topic today, the consumption crisis, it's extremely timely. It's an incredibly important juncture for the global food system. We're facing a global challenge of feeding 10 billion by 2050, and yet we're not successfully feeding the planet today. We have over 800 million hungry, 1 to 2 billion with micronutrient deficiencies. We have obesity rising, and we need to feed another 2 billion people in 30 years. So we're also exceeding planetary boundaries right now, the concept of Earth overshoot, and we're facing water and energy shortages around the world. And we can't just focus on one of these problems at one time. They're all interrelated. We need to view them together systemically. That's what we refer to as the food, water, energy nexus. So we have a grand challenge ahead of us, just 30 years away. We need to produce enough high-quality food to feed an expanding, increasingly urbanized population in a way that ensures a livable environment for everyone and preserves resources for future generations. So it's really the ultimate experiment in sustainable intensification, doing more with less, and the stakes couldn't be any higher, right? At the center of this nexus is the global food system, arguably the most powerful yet destructive system that we have, right? As the Barilla Center for Food and Nutrition notes, what we eat can hurt. And perhaps nowhere is our excessive consumption and production behavior more costly than in the food sector. In the United States and developed countries like ours, food is really ubiquitous, right? It surrounds us. It's available on a 24/7 basis. It's relatively inexpensive. It's available in big quantities because we place value on size, and we expect great variety and perfect produce. It's also cheap and easy to dispose of. So you put all those things together, and it leads to a lot of waste, right? So in short, one of the things I want to cover today is, we've lost touch with the value of our food and what it takes to produce it. In just 75 years, we've gone from a warrior culture of responsibility to a culture of abundance, where excessive consumption reinforces excessive production. So all of that overproduction, all of that easy disposal leads to excessive waste of food. So in the US, we're wasting 30 to 40% of our food. Globally, estimates of food loss and waste go up to about 50% annually, 1 to 2 billion tons annually. Those levels of food loss and waste obviously are not sustainable. And as emerging countries become more developed and adopt Western diets and values, we're in for even more of a problem, right? So, and one thing also, we're further challenged by meta trends right now. Demand for more fresh food, more choice, quick pickup options for healthy food, and online purchases and delivery. And so the challenge that presents is that all those things make it easier for us to obtain food. We're less vested in going after it and obtaining it, and therefore it's easier for us to discard it. So keep in mind, every step in the food production process creates environmental and social externalities from farm to fork. And so really reducing waste, preventing it from occurring in the future is really a priority.
Stephen, thank you very much. Next up is Jorge Fonseca from the United Nations Food System Strategic Program. Jorge, welcome to the panel. Just some opening statements about technology and the future of food production.
Thanks a lot to everyone, to the organizers, to Todd. I'd like to highlight as first point in my intro are two issues when it comes to global consumption: breakthrough technology and being aware that when we go into changing consumption, food consumption behavior, we need to be careful about a few items. So let's be aware of how we develop technology and how we develop food consumption. Let me tell you a story. 30 years ago, just picture this, in Costa Rica, Central America, very close to the rainforest, a young farmer was in tears right in front of 2 acres of a sweet potato, completely burned by an overdose of herbicides. That same, and for those that have grown sweet potatoes are quite robust. They tolerate high levels of chemicals. But they were 90% gone. 15 years later, the same young farmer, failing to farm, went to study packaging sciences, thinking that plastics would be the panacea for food safety and for creating an easy way to market food products worldwide. And then 15 years later, I'm actually here representing FAO as the leader of an agenda that is quite new in the Food and Agriculture Organization. It's called the Urban Food Action Agenda. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because a lot of people that look into breakthrough technology, like the case of chemicals with only one active ingredient, would tend to see the short-term results. We're seeing it also with plastics. UNEP is calling. I'm an advocate myself of looking into better management of plastic packaging. I used to be an advocate of only focusing on rural development, but when it comes to changing behavior, we need to look for changing behavior of those that are already doing it in a wrong way and not necessarily all of the consumers. And in this case, I think urban consumers can do a lot to change the way we produce in agriculture.
Thanks very much. And now to Basant Rathore, who's come in from Delhi, India. Basant, you're a senior media executive and looking at a commercial model to tell these stories. You're committed to telling the stories, but figuring out the commercial model is never very easy. Go ahead.
As we see it, if you look at it, we are in the middle of several crises as we understand. There's a consumption crisis, energy crisis, and crises of all sorts are actually engulfing us. From a very simplistic standpoint, a crisis is a natural outcome of progress. If you look at it from the agricultural revolution to the industrial revolution or the scientific revolution or even now the technological revolution, each revolution of ours has pushed us to progress, but it has also plunged us deeper into crisis. And we've got newer crises coming up. Now, the positive side of crisis, the way I look at it, is to look at it from the point of view of saying, in crisis, we see human ingenuity. We see human creativity coming out. We see human willingness to fight and come back against odds. It's at this area is where is something that excites me. From a media standpoint, I'd like to believe that we as media can play a significant role in solving some of these crises by involving communities. And I think a large part of my work actually takes me to that area. I'm not a sustainability expert, but I understand there's a problem and a problem needs a solution. And that solution has to come from the citizens themselves. What is the role that media can play in helping solve these issues? And that's where my play is, essentially.
Thanks very much. We have a lot of food sustainability experts on the panel here, but I want to first look at the overconsumption of energy with Ambassador Jim Woolsey. Ambassador Woolsey, we were speaking this morning. You don't believe this is an overconsumption issue when it comes to energy. You believe it's an issue with price. Now, the latest, we're in one of the great oil-producing nations in the world right now. West Texas Intermediate is trading at $62 a barrel, Brent oil at $70 a barrel. Talk to us about how price is a problem and the challenge with OPEC and the open markets.
Well, everything with respect to energy in one manifestation or another it can be read to be a problem, but we have a very different situation with respect to energy now in the U.S. and in the developed world particularly than was the case 5, 10, 15 years ago. First of all, the development of hydrofracturing, fracking is colloquially called, in West Texas, that has changed the production of oil and gas very substantially. It has produced a way, essentially, to explore for natural gas in a relatively quick and effective way that searches the entire former deep ocean in prehistoric times, the area just below it, below the ocean, back hundreds of millions of years ago, was filled with the residue of plants and small animals and the like. That has now become an area which one can search very easily and cheaply, and then drill and produce oil and gas from it much more effectively than could have been the case a long time ago. or even as recently as 5 to 10 years ago. I think the most revolutionary aspect of this is going to be natural gas. About 2 months ago on the Henry Hub, the market down in Houston, natural gas was going for a negative $3 per million BTUs. What that means is that the people who produce natural gas found it cheaper to give it away for free than to try to produce it and process it. That only lasted a month or so, but it is an illustration of the degree to which the inexpensive nature and the effectiveness of hydrofracturing has produced a situation where natural gas for generation of electricity and for other purposes is coming in much faster and much more effectively than people thought was going to be the case before. This has also affected, hydrofracturing has also affected the cheap nature, comparatively speaking, of producing oil, and has, I think, for those who look at the question objectively, has also made it not only more affordable, but also quite reasonable in terms of environmental issues for producing natural gas. Finally, over the long run future, I think natural gas will serve as a bridge, but the ultimate bridge, I think, is solar, particularly because of the development of new batteries, and they get better all the time, as do the solar cells get better all the time. And it has created a situation with respect to renewables. Yes, there is a spot, I think, here and there for wind, for steam, maybe for others. But generally speaking, solar and batteries for storage and natural gas, as in the way I described, I think is fundamentally changing the nature of energy, and it is making it plausible for collection and distribution around the world to be much easier than it has been up until a few years ago.
Ambassador Woolsey, just to follow up, what do you, when you look at the price of oil and natural gas today, what the market says it is, what is the bottom? Where's the top? I mean, do you foresee a swing north in terms of the prices, or going further cheaper?
I think that we may be in the $60 a barrel realm, about where things will nest for a time. The point, though, I think, is that Saudi Arabia will not be able to do what they did for generations, and essentially use oil that was comparatively highly priced from their own production to create a situation where their young men did not need to work. Those of you who have been near or in Saudi Arabia in recent times, you see lots of young men on the streets. Women are permitted to work to some extent in clothing stores and the like, but even in other societies in that part of the world, you don't see, particularly in Saudi Arabia, you don't see young men working. And I think that is going to change. It's already begun to change, and that it will have I think, a substantial effect on the Saudis' ability to conduct the business the way they've done it historically.
Thanks very much. Steve Finn, let's switch to food sustainability and overconsumption of food. We were talking just a few minutes ago about why do we go to a restaurant and they feed us much more than we should be eating? I mean, you can tell from me, I'm eating enough for 3 people, sometimes 4 or 5 people. But why is that? What's going on? Is it marketing? Is it culture? Can you comment a little bit on that?
Yeah, I think it's both. It's largely culture. I mentioned before this culture of abundance that we have grown into with amazing speed since the post-war years. It just boggles the mind how quickly that has happened. But again, we're surrounded by food. It's everywhere, and nowhere. It really becomes apparent when you travel, right? And I can't tell you on the last 2 or 3 flights I was at and through airports, you're always offered food. It's always there. So it's all around us. We can get it on a 24/7 basis and virtually any kind. We expect tremendous variety when we go to the stores, and so that leads to a lot of stocking of various different bread, for example. It leads to a lot of stocking, which stems from a lot of production and leads to a lot of waste. So, yeah, and basically every, our culture is really assumes that we will have a lot of food. It will always be present. And as a result, we feel like we can always replace it. We equate value with big quantities, and anywhere you drive, at least in the States, you get combination meals, and pricing is always associated with a large quantity, typically. So lots of food, always available, relatively inexpensive, and as a result, we think little of discarding it because we can always get more, and that really is at the heart of the tremendous amount of waste that we have in the U.S. and in other developed countries as well.
But is it primarily an American problem, or are you seeing this globally?
I think it's a developed world problem. I think it's certainly and critically an American problem, but UK, other developed nations as well. And I think my concern is that as one of the things that we really have to keep an eye on is, as the Western diet spreads and we have emerging economies that, that enter into the developed world, those individuals, rightly want a higher level of products, and they want meat proteins, and they want food items that tax the environment more substantially, and whenever so there's an even greater cost when we produce those items and waste them. So we need to keep that in mind as we have a goal in place, Target 12.3, led by the UN and FAO, which calls for a 50% reduction in food waste by 2030 and reductions in losses along supply chains. And as we're all working to obtain that, and we have a lot of work to do, but we also have these other headwinds that might even make that more difficult. And so we need to be wary of the spread of the Western diet and those values, that lack of proper value around food and food resources that we have in the U.S. and other developed countries. And somehow we need to skip that. We need to prevent that value, that lack of value around food from going to the emerging countries as they become ever more developed.
So it's an education issue. Jasmine, take me to Paraguay. Are you seeing the same thing? The food, the consumption habits are too much. Are you seeing that in Paraguay?
Well, I think the issue in Paraguay is a bit different, and that will take me to talk about how food is produced or why food is not produced and how that is linked to the food consumption crisis globally. One of the stories that we published last year is about El Chaco. El Chaco is the second most important ecosystem in South America aside from the Amazons. And it's also the place with the highest rate of deforestation in the world. And one of the stories that we published is actually about how European meat consumers are accelerating the rate of deforestation in El Chaco in 2 ways. They're buying charcoal that comes from fallen trees from this region in my country. And 2, they're eating meat from cattle that pastures in El Chaco. And the cattle ranchers, the people that are responsible for deforestation in El Chaco, are large landowners. And Paraguay is the country with the most unequal access to with the most unequal distribution of land, which is one of the things that fuels the food consumption crisis. What does this mean? It means that landowners, large landowners, and also state agents who protect their interests are turning communities who can actually feed themselves, who work the land and grow their vegetables, into destitutes, because these large landowners want more land so that they can increase their revenues from exports of meat or soybeans to countries like China, for instance. That goes back to the culture of consumption, what people are consuming in Europe or China or other countries, and how that might fuel the food crisis in Paraguay.
So it's a great story for your platform in Paraguay. Can you talk about how difficult it is to sell that story to a global platform? I have my own challenges in our newsroom or our editorial side, and always have. But how hard is it to get that story out to a wider audience?
Well, it's difficult because we always say in El Surtidor, and we have shared this with other colleagues, that the scope of the tragedies or the challenges that we face today are no longer enough to get people to care or to pay attention to what we're publishing. I think that it's never been so easy to launch a news media site or to publish, but it's never been so hard to catch people's attention. So I think that as journalists or as activists, we all have to make an extra effort to actually convey these highly complex issues. But I think that our duty is to actually translate that to make people to understand these issues. That is our responsibility. I think that our job goes around that.
That's always been the problem in television news. Not enough pictures, too complicated, too long, too hard to break down. Basant, in your news organization, you're on the commercial side, and you're supporting this. And I just wonder, first of all, how? Where's the money? And why?
Two things. What we have done at our newsroom is we've identified 7 principles of development. When I say development, they are essentially the 7 principles that are at the very foundation of our editorial philosophy. So we look at issues like water conservation, environment conservation, women empowerment, education, health, poverty, and population management. So there are 7 areas which we've identified from an editorial standpoint that these are the issues that we feel strongly about. These are the issues that need attention by governments across the different governments across India. And these are the issues, if addressed, will lead us to progress. Now, having said that, from a commercial side, from a brand owner perspective, what we've done is the very same principles that govern editorial are the same principles that govern my brand philosophy. Now, having said that, so that means my content and me are on the same platform. And our entire attempt is to create content that is able to either spread awareness or create awakening or initiate people into action around each of these 7 areas. So I'll give you a small example. In India, for example, there is this custom of serving water to anybody who comes home. So a glass of water is served to you, a full glass of water is served to you. Now, rarely do people want to drink that entire full glass, but it's a cultural custom. And if you don't offer water, people take offense. Even in a hotel, if you end up in a hotel, they'll serve you some water or some in a restaurant, wherever. So in a city, what we did was, we said, instead of serving the entire glass full of water, can you serve just half a glass? We went to every restaurant, every hotel in the city and told them that this is what you should be doing. They did that. At the same point in time, we went out to all the students across all the schools in the city and told them that for 30 days, I'll give you this little sheet of paper and say, can you serve half glass to all the guests who arrive at home? That's it. A simple solution magnified through the newspaper. The entire city rallied around it and millions of liters of water got saved. So that's just one example. And I've got several examples of this kind across each of these areas.
So you're getting the readers and thus furthermore getting the advertisers.
Absolutely.
Are advertisers willing to pay more for really good content?
Yeah. How I look at my role is essentially to say it's a market where the economics of the newspaper business are driven by advertising revenues. The newspaper is kind of subsidized from a pricing standpoint, so subscription revenues are low. advertisers are going to pay you money if you have a large audience. That large audience, if it is engaged well enough, then you get a premium in terms of advertising revenues. So what I'm saying is that when, as a responsible newspaper, I'm creating a very beneficial environment for the society through my newspaper by setting agenda for society, involving communities, engaging people, that means the readers or my audience is far more engaged with me as a brand. When they are more engaged, that environment is absolutely right for advertising to be placed in it. If that environment is right, it's going to work for you and therefore higher revenues. So I look at it that way. A newspaper title which engages audience better will stand a better chance to do revenue monetization. That's the loop. I look at it.
Thank you. Jorge, how do we solve this problem of food overconsumption through technology? What do you foresee in the future?
I think that the first thing that we need to remember is that there's not a single country today that is dealing well with it. In fact, the data that we have worldwide is obesity rate is going up in every single country with the exception of 2 or 3 that are in some civil crisis. Now, it's not for the same reason. As Steve was saying, the higher the income, the more we tend to consume, and that applies also for food. But in poor countries, the issue is about quality of food. The obesity rates are going up because of the consumption of non-nutritious food that essentially are providing more energy than any other thing. So, and we used to think that that was an issue for developed countries, but this is now across all the board. Now, also, it's important to remember in this forum that for the first time in several decades, a lot of countries have seen life expectancy to decline, even developed countries, even some of the countries that you have mentioned here today. Whether it is associated to food habits, there's some debate about it, but I think in some cases you could connect that. Now, when it comes to try to address this issue of overconsumption, certainly we need to apply a little bit to nudging here. Culture is already, food consumption is part of the culture. And I think before we were talking about a country that I happen to know quite well, Saudi Arabia, since I helped to develop the national strategy for food losses and waste. And one of the things that I recall very well was asking to the second largest retail store, why is it that are you putting in every individual serving 700 grams of basmati rice? 700 grams of basmati rice, that's almost 3 times the portion that is recommended. And the answer was very simple. He said, if we do it less, let's say 30% less, they're not going to buy it. They're not going to like it, and we already did it. There's complaints about it. So what I'm trying to say here is it shouldn't be only an effort of one single company, because otherwise they will be at the mercy of the market, of the competition. This is where the public sector can provide an environment for incentives to, first, to provide better quality of food, and also to try to do some nudging, try to influence that behavior in consumption.
Thank you. I want to take it back to the overconsumption of energy and Ambassador Jim Woolsey, whether it's overconsumption or an issue with the price in OPEC and the open market. Can you talk about how this impacts geopolitical conflict? You had to be looking at that over at the CIA in the mid-90s.
Well, the issue of essentially being at the mercy of the Middle East because of relying on them for our oil was part of the public dialogue for years and still is to some extent. But the real issue with respect to oil particularly is not so much that, which is a balance of payments question, really. It's essentially the title of the article I wrote for Foreign Affairs some years ago called Turning Oil into Salt. Salt was the preeminent commodity in the world up until about the 1880s. Roman soldiers were paid in salt. The whole question of salt-produced wars in Latin America up until around the 1890s. Word salary comes from salt. Salt was extremely important economically because it was the only way to preserve meat, except in the later years by freezing it. And people understood that, and so they salted their meat. That produced a situation where salt was extremely valuable, and it created a sort of crazy kind of international set of values with respect to storage and expenditures for meat preservation. I think that began to change some in the 1890s and around 1900 with the coming of very large-scale electricity, at least in the U.S. And then after that, it certainly picked up in post-World War II years when everybody had freezers and refrigerators and so forth. But it was a different world back before everybody had a refrigerator and a freezer, or at least the very large share of the population did. And that has, in turn, really meant that salt has almost no value anymore. You put it on the sidewalks in some climates anyway, in the winter when the snow comes. You put it on corn on the cob with pepper. That's about it. And I think that what we need to realize is that the value of substances can change and change radically with technology, and make prior decisions such as that what matters is oil's balance of payments with us, make them irrelevant. And what my colleague and I, when we wrote this piece for Foreign Affairs, were saying is, yes, turn oil into salt. Make it possible that everybody can treat oil the way they treat salt. People will get bored with salt. That's what you want. Next issue.
Thanks so much, Ambassador Jim Woolsey, former director of the CIA. We're now going to turn it over to our audience, open it up to some questions back there. Are there any questions out there?
Hello. So I have a question for all of you, and how do you find the use of gene-modified food as one of way to cheapen the prices for food and reduce hunger? Is it the right way or not? Because the people in the world also consider that the use of GMF is very harm for our health and life. Thank you.
Jorge, do you want to take that?
I think genetically modified foods have been already scrutinized for several decades, and there's still the debate whether it is good or not. And I think is also we have enough evidence that can support a lot of the agricultural development in many countries where we have done it. It also depends on what type of food we're talking about. Because it happens that sometimes the scrutiny is not about the genetically modified food, but the subsequent technology that comes with it, which is by having a genetically modified crop that allows you to use more of a herbicide that perhaps could, like my example at the beginning, could be toxic for the soil. So this is what I would think we just need to pay attention on what are the subsequent results of that genetically modified food, not necessarily the food itself, but the technology that is taking advantage for it. But at the same time, I think we shouldn't put all our eggs in the same basket, and having genetically modified food in certain areas where we have hunger doesn't mean that we're not going to continue looking for other modalities of production, of course, knowing that a lot of the problem that we have today is the having a narrow range of crops and varieties, and we have gone from a huge amount of diversity of crops to a very narrow one. So we need to be careful with that, and then we are marginalizing a lot what used to be indigenous food, in part also because of some of the standards of quality that some voluntary schemes have placed, as well as others that are more of a enforced, like a codex, for example.
Thank you. We have another question out here in the crowd, fourth row.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And my name is Kaya Tabashitov. I'm recently joined to the first president, the Elbassi Foundation. And I would like just to come from previous session and the three particular definition of interconnection, interdependence, and indivisibility. And I would like to suggest maybe another title of this, our discussion for today: Love, come and go, but you have to eat every day. This is a great problem now. And in my understanding that from day to day, the food production and the problems of the food itself becoming more challengeable in the world, especially it takes into practically reflection in the whole world, and maybe the representatives of the farm organization and the farmer unity, he knows about it more deeper than we. But I would like to suggest just to see by another viewpoint on the region of Kazakhstan and Central Asia, for example. Kazakhstan, this is a huge territory, the ninth territory in the world. Somebody is saying that this is the biggest territory in the world and the country who has no any access to the sea. But we have two very big markets, especially in the food production. China, 2 billion, and we have some Russian Federation as another direction. But in my understanding, if we produce a big industrial, agro-industrial center in the Central Asia, for example, including Kazakhstan, because in Kazakhstan we have a big experience in the cattle breeding, we have a big experience on the wheat production. If we include Uzbekistan cotton production, and if we resolve the resources, water resource management, it will be a big potential, not only for this part of the world, but the whole continental Europe. And I would like to suggest that it will be pure food and less expensive. And that's why, so I would like just to pay attention to this particular very important element conceptually, that the food is becoming more challengeable. And for this time being, we have new challenges, such as, for example, narco traffics, illicit arms trafficking, illegal migration, or so maybe in years, we include to this particular list food challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Steve, do you want to take that up?
You want to phrase the question?
If I have it right, I think he's talking about the ability of Central Asia, Kazakhstan in particular, to really accelerate and lead the way in food production. And it's perhaps not being exploited enough.
Yeah, it's not exactly my area of expertise. Obviously, it sounded as if you were pointing out to a lot of the positives of that and bringing higher quality food to individuals in the region and being able to export, and there was a lot of great things that go along with that. So I think that all sounds very positive to me. The one, I was going to link a little bit to Jorge's point before, and I'll link to it here. I would just point out that as I mentioned before, there are tremendous costs to excessive production of food, right? The food system is very taxing on the environment, which I think everybody here knows. And one thing to keep in mind, and this is an example from the US, as as we overproduce, and there are many that think that's a very good, positive thing, because a fallback is, well, we can take that excess food, and I'll point to bread, and I'll point to baked goods, and we can donate those to those who are hungry. And so there's a lot of recycling efforts that go along those lines. The downside of that is, though, we're one, going through all the production effort, and moving and spending additional resources to move fairly poor quality food to those in the system who can least afford it, right? And so we're actually overproducing, spending more resources to move food to really exacerbate health problems of those lower on the chain. And so, and at the same time, we're actually somewhat perversely rewarding that behavior at the organizational level with tax deductions and good press. And so we really, it would be a different story if all of that was really high quality food, but we're moving a lot of poor quality food that way and creating even more problems. And we mentioned the obesity levels before, exacerbating that. So I think if I read your question right, it's a two-edged sword, all kinds of great things to increasing production, expanding markets, bringing in income, investing that elsewhere, feeding your people, all that great. I would just, at the same time, point out, keep in mind that some of the negatives of the overproduction issues that we're talking about here today, and factor that in as well, I guess.
Great, thank you. We have another question from the audience.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Gerald Thompson. I'm from the Caribbean. I'm a medical doctor, and I've been quite surprised, Mr. Finn and Mr. Woolsey, in terms of your view on overproduction. I've always thought that overproduction within one country is a good thing, because then you're able to trade. I have an issue more with the quality and the nature of the food that's actually being produced. Because the real crisis today is non-communicable diseases, your cancers, your high blood pressure, the alarming rise in diabetes and other things of that nature. And I believe when you mention about lower quality foods can be shifted to another country, foods that might have in high fructose corn syrup, the artificial sweetener, or foods that are high in salt. I know, Mr. Woolsey, you mentioned about we could look at salt in a different way in relation to oil. But these are the type of products that I believe are fueling this new rise in the new crisis of non-communicable disease. Now, it's interesting what you mentioned about salt, because we always felt that salt is one of the components for high blood pressure. We're now finding that it's not so much the amount of salt, but the fact that people are not taking enough potassium in their foods, they're not getting enough vegetables, they're not getting enough greens, which has high levels of potassium. That's what's going to help to bring down the blood pressure. So, we say to consumption is the type of foods people are consuming, and I don't know if you could respond to that.
Actually, I think you might have misunderstood me. I think we're saying the same thing. It sounded to me as if you were talking about the downside of transferring low-quality foods down the food chain, and that is what I was alluding to. So I think we're aligned on that point.
Jorge, do you want to take a shot at that?
I think you're absolutely right. And if I understood well, you're from Jamaica, right? Is that what you said? No? Oh, okay. But it also applies to, I've never been in St. Vincent, but I've been in several places in the Caribbean. And it's important to mention the situation of the small island development states, because a lot of people would, in a debate like this, would say, how do we really know that international trade have affected the non-communicable diseases? Because there are many factors. There are many factors. It's not just international trade. It's many things that are ongoing. Urbanization. We tend to have more machines. We don't move as much as before. We are using less energy on a daily basis. But if there are regions where we can actually look into the before and after international trade, and particularly international trade of non-nutritious food is in the small island states, especially in the South Pacific and in some of the Caribbean, where you can see really that the diet changed dramatically because of a lot of the food that some other country would not necessarily eat at their home place.
Thanks very much. We're almost out of time, but I want to give Ambassador Jim Woolsey a final word on this to wrap things up, the overconsumption crisis, food, energy, and the pricing issues that you've addressed.
Well, thank you. The other speakers have, I think, done a more effective job in being focused on the food aspect of this, and was entirely almost focused on energy. But I do think that all one has to do is walk around the streets of the United States and see that there's an obesity crisis being seen now. And from my own just conversations with friends and doctors and the rest, it's serious, it's demanding, it is something that we simply have to change. And when you dovetail it with the price orientation and the taste sometimes, liking things that are sweet and so on, in that other people have spoken about. When you put all those together, we have a real national problem of the first order. We're not just talking about a lot of folks have eaten a little bit too much. We're talking about a major disease crisis for our country and the Western world as a whole that eats and drinks things that are sweet and creates problems.
Thanks so much. I believe we're out of time. Is that right? Are we out of time? Okay. We're out of time. Thanks so much to our panelists here. Let's give them a round of applause on a great discussion. Thanks so much, guys.